Welcome to the pedal.ly Jam session, where we talk with gear innovators, musicians, and organizations making waves in the music scene. I'm Ryan Parker.
And I'm Brian Murphy.
And together we're the guys from pedal.ly. Today on the Jam session, we are welcoming Justin Bryant. Justin is the Director of Sales and Operation for 2Notes North America. How you doing, Justin?
Doing great. How are you guys?
Doing good, man.
Good.
Can't complain. So let me give you the ground rules of the jam session. So it's 1 hour, we've got you, and no topics are taboo. So if we stray away from music gear, music and stuff like that, that's perfectly fine. So the whole goal here is to get to know you, get to know 2Notes, and get to have the audience understand what you guys are all about and what you're all about. So let's get rocking. So first question, give us the history of 2Notes and how you came about being such a pivotal role in making sure that 2Notes is expanding inside of the Americas.
Well, yeah, that's a great question, and that doesn't get asked very much. So I'm happy to discuss that. So 2Notes is about a 14-year-old company, and it's based out of South France, more specifically an area called Montpellier, or if you're from where I'm from, Montpellier, France. And the CEO is a guy named Guillaume Peel. Guillaume is very, very smart. He actually was teaching coursework out there related around things like convolution engineering, kind of the newer end of electrical engineering. So he's actually got a PhD. Several of our employees were from the university out there that are also PhD people. So we've got people doing everything from AI-based work to hardware design to, software. I mean, there's a lot of different angles, but he's a very, very sharp guy. And quite simply, and I try not to paraphrase or say anything incorrectly than he would say it, but it was about 13, 14 years ago that he wasn't happy with how a Palmer direct box sounded, and he thought he could do a better job. And quite simply, he found some things with the load design that he didn't agree with. He thought it could be a better touch experience, better amp sound experience. But then convolution tech was starting to really come out, but it was all predicated around reverbs. Like, how could you get these 60-second cavern reverbs and things like that? So the whole convolution engine stuff started. He was like, we could take that same exact thing and we could do this with guitars. And it was really about how you could get this consistent mic'd up perfect guitar sound every time, where you didn't have phase problems, you didn't have bleed problems, you didn't have all the inherent problems of mic and cabinets. The biggest one being, it's very difficult to mic guitar cabinets and get good sounds with it. So that was kind of the impetus of the company. And he and I became friends probably 10 years ago. I met some of the guys that worked for him out of Canada in Nashville at an amp show. And I saw the videos that Pete Thorne had done. And this is probably 2011, 2012. And it's, that stuff back then was, Kemper was around, but people didn't understand how they worked. It was, the guys in
line
the were, yeah, exactly. I mean, people knew of the pods and things like that, but something like speaker tech, load box stuff, that was just something that most people didn't understand. And conversely, a problem I was having at the time was I was playing with some up and coming country acts, and they had pretty much gotten away from stage volume, well before that. So it was all about whatever amplifier you had was going to be too loud. And the other problem was that I did a lot of session work at home. And even though I had like a closet designed, for blasting guitar amps, it still didn't make a lot of sense. And again, it's also very difficult. So, you have to get microphones, and you want ribbon mics, and okay, those are $1,000+ and then you have to buy really nice preamps, and then you have to know what you're doing. So it's a pretty heavy investment to get the tech to work. And I'm not trying to in-run your question of how it started, but that was the core problem of, okay, there's a market here for this, and he thought people would want it. And someone like me was a pretty early adopter because it was solving problems that I had. And I remember the Torpedo Live was the first product that I have, which I still have in a rack down there. I just remember the first show I took it to, and I remember the sound guy kind of, squinching his nose and just being very like, oh, is this some like Digitech from 1990? What is this thing? Because they've all been around people that have brought processors, and it's not that the processors sounded necessarily awful. It was that people didn't dial them up very well. So they just sounded like, shrill and boomy at the same time. They didn't have any mid-range you could hear. And again, some of it was the technology and some of it was how people dialed it. So you always kind of have people going like this before they, they see anything, because they're just used to putting microphones in front of the speakers. But I just remember the second we plugged into it, the guy was like, I don't know what that is, but it's amazing. And that was like the validator for me. And I may say this later in the conversation, but I've come to the conclusion that you can tell a guitar player they play well, and everybody's got imposter syndrome and everybody doesn't think they play well sometimes. So when somebody comes and tells you you did a great job, it's really hard sometimes to say thank you. You're kind of like, well, I know everything that went wrong, so you must know it too, and you're just messing with me. But if you tell a guitar player how great their sound is, that seems to really resonate with people. And it's got to be an honest thing, because that's not an easy thing to go to. And a layperson isn't going to say your guitar sound was great. Maybe, you know what I mean? They don't know what that means, but
especially a live act is very loud. There's a lot going on.
Well, and especially when you get the front of the house guy telling you sound good and the tech works perfect for you.
Yes,
that's awesome. Like that's the identifier right there.
It absolutely is. And the first thing that you've done is you've eliminated a big problem for them. And that's kind of like what I said before. You got phase problems, you have bleed problems, you have volume problems, and PAs have gotten really, really good. In-ear monitors are very prevalent. And I will be the first one to say, if I had my way, I would love to blast a guitar cabinet, at 120 decibels all the time. Now my ears tell me otherwise. And it's funny, because we go back 25 years ago, you'd see a half stack in a coffee shop, you'd see a half stack in an arena, you'd see a half stack in the garage, you'd see a half stack in the bedroom. They were everywhere, and that's just what people used, but they were very impractical, to get that thing there. So going back to what you said about the sound guy, you immediately become best friends with him, because you've taken so much issue that he already has, and you put it into a controllable, environment.
All right. So I have to ask you this question, Justin. So, dude, you're a freaking amazing guitar player. Like, you are amazing, man. I got to know, what's your practice routine? Like, how did your skill set come about? Because I'm a hack. I love the guitar, but man, I'm a hack. I'm even a hack on the drums. I try. I'm 4 months into drum lessons and I'm enjoying it, but I'm still a hack musician when it comes to all this stuff. What was your, when did you start playing guitar, and what would you attribute to, man, how solid of a player you are?
So I'll do the self-deprecating thing, and I'm being sincere. Thank you. Understand that's hard for me to say. I'm very critical of myself, like a lot of other people are. And I always feel like whenever the spotlight's most on you is when you always feel like you're at your worst. And by the way, pre-COVID, I was playing 8 to 10 times a month, playing with all different types of bands. And not to run this again, but I loved playing with bands that were playing R&B music, and then they'd throw in Toto or Steely Dan. And then conversely, I'd go play with a country band or a pop country band, and then, go do a hard rock band. So I've always been a guy that really wanted to play all different types of music. And I kind of get bored if I have to do the same thing over and over. So thank you. But again, that's always a very weird thing for me to acknowledge, because I go, man, I sound terrible. But I also get stages, by the way. And I saw Steve Vai last night, and we could bring that there. Steve was absolutely amazing. And it's one of those guys within 2 notes, it's Steve Vai, right?
Yeah.
But everybody, I think, goes through that. And I've gotten pretty self-deprecating at times, where I think that only am I bad. Then I start listening to people, not Steve, but I listen to other players that are great, and I go, well, they suck too. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, well, does anybody sound good? I mean, I think it's because we're so used to perfect and polished on the internet.
Yeah.
That I think that really kind of creates a weird thing for us. And guys my age, and you guys are from this time too, and I'll come back to your question, is, we had to figure things out. We had to use our ears to figure things out. We played in bands. You try to learn a Van Halen song or something, and you do the best you could. And if you remember, the tab stuff that was out was pretty awful, and of course you looked at it like it was gospel. So it's like, okay, I must be doing this wrong. Or you'd see 20 notes on one string when really it was 3 notes. And then they went to the next string and another 3 notes. So it was an ultimate lesson in futility of how to learn stuff. Right. But when you hear somebody play something a little bit better than you or different than you, you'd go there and go, okay, how did you do that? Right.
Yeah.
And also back then, since there weren't really any rule books, right? Everybody had to kind of get their own fingerings for things, but it really was back to, you had to use your ears. You had to really discern things differently. You couldn't slow things down like you can now. You can't watch YouTube. And by the way, when you watch somebody on YouTube play something, you can automatically hear the notes and you can see the relationship where they are on the fretboard, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I show people like how to play a C scale, the same C scale in like 8 different positions to show people how complex guitar can be. Because which way is right? Well, they're kind of all right, but which way are you supposed to play? So that gap has really been shortened thanks to things like YouTube, right? It was also, unless you read like a Guitar Player magazine and saw like the spotlight players like Mike Varney and those guys had, you really didn't know who people were, other than people that may be in your local music scene. And I'm from Indianapolis, which we had a handful of really great people, but you don't get that kind of exposure to a more broader thing, and things like YouTube have done that. So I'll now answer your question. I lived in a little farmhouse in the suburbs just outside of Indianapolis. I was an only child till I was 13. And I think I realized by the time I was 13, 14, I was never going to be a great athlete, which was kind of like, what people did at school. And I'm sure you guys are no different. I'm thinking about everybody that plays guitar probably has the guys I hate are the ones like, I was a great football player and they're a great guitar player, right? It's like, those are the guys they hate. Well, I started playing in 87, 88, and I started playing probably because I think Prince was the inspiration, but Van Halen was like kind of what knocked the wall down. And, he was the king of kings, still is, but definitely in the 80s, there was pretty much, not anybody could touch. So I learned some things like that. I sat for hours just trying to do finger tapping. In fact, I played guitar for like 2 or 3 months, and I entered myself into a school talent show with the whole gist being that I was just going to finger tap for like 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Right.
And I remember it very well. And I had a Crate G10 amplifier, and I was super nervous. And the amp sounded terrible. I sounded pretty terrible, but people thought it was cool. And it's still weird if I go back to my hometown, there's people that still remember that. And in my head, I'm going, thank God there was no phone. There were no phones. There's no recordings of that, because I know what it was.
Yeah, I could see how the Instagram memes would have been on.
I mean,
2 minutes of tapping.
Yeah, and then the self-deprecation that come after that probably would never have allowed this conversation to happen. But anyway, so you did ask a good question. So started with the Van Halen stuff. I tried to start taking lessons pretty quickly because I knew that there were things I wanted to learn lead guitar. And again, when I started playing, and probably not much different from you guys, it's like you get a Melbay book and you start on the high E string, and then you play real simple melodies, and then you go maybe to the B string. And if you're really good, you get to go to the G string. But you could go through the first 3 or 4 books and you're not playing any songs that you've ever heard of.
No, you're playing Ode to Joy and terrible
she
things.
She sells seashells by the seashore. Yeah.
And when every kid that wants to play rock guitar at the time, that's exactly what you didn't want to do, but you also believed that was what you had to do.
Right. That was the path.
Play that stuff. So the rock stuff's like level 15, you're on level 1, right?
Yeah.
And maybe if you're lucky, but I happened to get a really good guitar teacher. And to go back, I probably played 8 or 9 months on my own, and I just got a songbook and just went through all the little chord diagrams and kind of taught myself that. So I probably half-assed knew how to play probably 30 or 40 chords, but didn't understand the relationship of them. So I just knew that I wanted to play Van Halen, and I luckily got in with a guy that was great at it, and we're still friends to this day. And I ended up working for him years later. I'll say his name, Tom Fowler, because Tom, I'm gonna make sure you see this later so you know that I talked about. But those are the kinds of sparks that you need. You need that kind of person that you connect with, right?
Yeah.
And Tom can play all the Van Halen stuff. So like the first lesson we're in there, and he showed me Best of Both Worlds.
Yeah.
So I'm going from Ode to Joy, half-assing these 30 chords, and then I'm playing like part of a song that I think is just phenomenal, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, my drum teacher's got me doing the same thing right now. And this is a shout out to Charge. He's got me doing the same thing where I'm 4 months in, and he's got me working on all the technical stuff of drums. And I've reached kind of what he calls the breaking point, because I'm self-taught on the guitar and I used to play drums just for fun. But he's like, all right, so we're about really a year into lessons, even though you're 4 months into lessons because you've played before. He's like, but you're at the breaking point, and every musician gets this point. Either you're going to break through this point, which is my interdependence of my limbs doing different things, or I'm going to give it up. Right. And I've been doing the functional side of the lesson so much that last lesson, he's like, dude, stop trying to play and play, like actually have fun playing. Stop trying to actually be, this functional thing. And so what he's tasked me with now is 15 minutes of the functional side of the instrument and 15 minutes of playing with music that I like, just so I can get the feel for playing the drums and enjoyment of it. Because I got to the breaking point where I'm like, this isn't fun anymore, after 4 months. And he's like, nah. And the other thing I learned, which was really interesting, is on the drums, I've been playing real quietly. And he's like, dude, playing quiet's not going to make the mistakes go away. He goes, if you're going to make a mistake, make it loud so you understand what you're doing and correct it. So being a novice to lessons, it's been a really interesting endeavor at 49 years old trying to take lessons. So it's been kind of a unique adventure. So yeah.
Well, I taught lessons for over 20 years, and something I could tell you emphatically is when you're a teenager and you're inspired, right? I think the key word's inspired. If you're inspired and you really want to become good, and you'll tend to see the progress more than you see the mistakes.
Yeah.
Like I remember the first time I started trying to play Eruption, I know it sounded like, cats being ran over by a bulldozer or something, right? A steamroller, but I saw progress, and I could hear that things were connecting together. Conversely, when you get a little older, the humility factor comes in very quickly and you just hear the mistakes.
Yeah.
And then you're kind of like, and I think it's when you're past about 25 or maybe 20 when that kicks in, right? Of can you stand the humiliation? But I think your teacher had a really good way to do that. And mine was kind of structured somewhat similar. And, I'd kind of always do what I wanted to do anyway. Sorry, Tom, but you knew that. You have to have a balance between the educational and learning the mechanics and any theory related to it, and just learning the inside of the music.
Yeah.
But your goal was to play music.
Yeah.
So if you get stuck on the academic stuff and your goal was to perform it, then that can be very, very frustrating. So, and then the other thing I will say is because I started playing in the later 80s, and, I'd open a guitar magazine and you'd see Paul Gilbert, you'd see Yngwie Malmsteen, you'd see Vinnie Moore, and those kinds of things were like, okay, what's next? And I remember buying, I was 13, it was like October of 1988, and I went to the tape store, and Yngwie Malmsteen had some tapes, and I was like, well, let me get his newest one because newer must be better than the old ones. So I got Odyssey. And honestly, Odyssey for me was probably the best thing because it was definitely his more commercial-y type music, like Joe Lynn Turner singing on it. So I could associate the songs a little better because it was familiar to stuff I'd heard on the radio to some extent.
It wasn't neoclassical crazy tapping singing about dragons and stuff like that?
It's love, dragons, or cars.
Right, exactly.
That's Yngwie's whole thing.
Well, and his whole thing now is donuts, where he yells at people for their donuts.
I'm not touching that one, but yes. And actually, I think a friend of mine that used to be my roommate is the guy that actually filmed that video thing from
Oh, really?
Yes. And I don't know if he had Dyn sing it or he was saying it first, but yeah, that's an old roommate of mine that's still a friend. He was that guy that videotaped a lot of that stuff out of that Pantera video. And that was at the Concrete Foundations thing that they had where they had different bands playing, certain sets. So Pantera and Yngwie were combined at the time. So, but anyway, I got super, super, super into Yngwie. And again, Odyssey was a good recording because it was more song structured. And by the way, there are tons of things were about dragons. That was still in there, and dungeons and stuff like that. But Joe Lynn Turner, I think, helped lyrically kind of get him out of that to a certain extent. But when I listened to that, I listened to it over and over and over and over. And then I started going back to the back catalog. I went to Marching Out. Then I went to Trilogy. Then I went to the Rising Force, his first solo record. And the first solo record on me was kind of lost because I didn't really understand instrumental music that well. So I'm kind of like, where are the words, right? So listening to that guitar was something my ear had to adopt to. But I mean, if you go back and listen to his first solo record, it's incendiary is the word I'd come up with.
Yeah, it's awesome. It was like when Racer X was out, and Paul Gilbert was playing with them, and you had, Marty Friedman was out with Cacophony back then. You had just some amazing players that were in these little bands that were just freaking awesome. Like, you just put the album on and of course, at that time I had the long hair and the earring, and so did he. His hair was down to his ass at that point. So it was fun. I don't see an Yngwie Malmsteen Fender in that lineup behind you with scalloped frets. Is that one on the end, the Yngwie?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Of course.
Oh, it is. Okay. With the scalloped frets and all.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
So I actually try to have Ingve.
I thought it was more of a cream color. That looked yellow from at least.
It's called vintage white, and I have a story I'll tell you real quick about the first Ingve Strat I had back in the early '90s. But no, this is a vintage white, I think it is. So it's like a yellow cream. Because when I saw that they had three colors back in the late '80s, early '90s, or late '80s, it was Sonic Blue, it was vintage white, and it was Candy Apple Red. Yeah. And I didn't want white. But I wanted the color that he played, which was a 70s Strat, but it was the lacquer was aging. So the lacquer was darkening, and that's why the guitar turned that way. I got a couple funny stories about the Ingve thing of recent too. So this is an Ingve Malmsteen. I think it's a Red Devil guitar pick.
Okay.
You would never guess who gave me this pick and a few others. It was Jeff Schroeder of the Smashing Pumpkins.
Oh, really?
And I saw Jeff last week. He's using Captor X's in his rig, and just my age. And Jeff is a huge Ingve fan. Really? And he opened the rack drawer and he's got the Red Devil Fender Ingve Malmsteen pedal. And he's like, yeah, the pedals aren't connected right now but it looks cool, you know? And I was like, man, we're way too similar. So I knew it impacted other people. And to go back on something you said, you know, pretty much at that point, I didn't care about anything other than playing guitar. I didn't care anything about music or guitar. And pretty much it's like, okay, I'm 13. I want to move to LA. 13, I only want to have friends that have long hair and like the same kind of music I do. It's like nothing else existed. The furthest thing I wanted to be was in the school I was in the little town I was in. You know, that was furthest from me. But going back to what you said again, like the Racer X stuff and the Marty Freeman and all those guys. To me as a kid, you know, when I would look out, you know, open the magazines or go buy a cassette, if you could find the Shrapnel stuff somewhere, right? It's hard to find. To me, I thought these guys must be playing stadiums all over the world. They just don't play in Indianapolis, right?
Yeah.
I was like, these guys must be gigantic, right? So, because to me, they were gods, you know, and they still are. So,
well, tell us how the whole thing with Smashing Pumpkins went. When you emailed me last week, when we were talking about doing the show this week, you're like, hey man, I've got this session with the Smashing Pumpkins. What was that like? Like, how, explain that. And on top of that, the recording process.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people don't know how many artists that Two Notes actually works with and how you get those sounds. It's not just a sound like an artist. It's actually you're going out to the artist, right?
Yeah, this is what's interesting is the Captor X, which is behind me, the Captor X came out in May of 2020. And we announced them at NAMM 2020. And oh, there you go.
There it is, right there. That's the bad boy.
Everybody needs to buy those from you guys.
Yes.
So the Captor X was released at NAMM 2020. I had just started with the company, and I didn't answer the question about Guillaume, but Guillaume and I were friends for many years. And I had started a consulting company. I was bought by another group. So I actually left playing music full time for several years. And then I got into tech, which is funny because you think you're not very good at these things. And why is the thing I'm good at not worth anything? You kind of go through that stuff. And long story short, I sold my consulting group to a larger firm that I had worked for years back. And after a couple of years, I was going through kind of what they call an earnout or a buyout. And Guillaume had sent a message just basically saying, hey, I need somebody that can run the North American side. And I'm going, okay, you need somebody that knows product. You need somebody that can play. You need somebody that knows business. You need somebody that understands logistics. You need somebody that can sell, you know. And I was going, I don't know anybody can do all those things, but I know a few people can do a couple of them. And then I said something about, well, I think I might be good at this. And I kind of put it down for a minute and didn't really think of it. And he said, well, you'd be great at it, but I don't think we can pay you enough. And I just kind of got to the point where, you know, I'm going through a buyout out of a company. And by the way, I didn't make millions or anything like that. But when you go start a company, and it's probably not different than having a band, but if you have a business that's done decently and you get bought out and you come along with the buyout, it's no longer your business anymore.
Yeah.
They may tell you that you're going to do everything the same.
You end up becoming the roadie of your own band.
Well, yeah. And you no longer have the control of things that you had. So it's not that things go horribly, but it's no longer yours. Right. And so you have to compromise things you didn't want to. And I didn't realize I probably was as unhappy as I was because I had a good team. But I just said, you know, maybe this is the time to do this. And everything just clicked. And I always think that things like that shouldn't be too complicated. But I saw where they were going and knew what was coming up, like with the Captor X stuff. And I was like, you know, if anybody could do this, it's me. And I kind of said, why not? You know, let's see where this goes. And then COVID hit. So we launched Captor X. I'm with the company 4 weeks. COVID starts. I'm like, wow, that was the fastest 4-week job I ever had. And and then like everybody, it was like a few weeks later, whatever orders people were making that they now stopped making, they started tripling or quadrupling those orders. So then it really became this grab of getting product out fast enough and being able to manufacture it enough. So we actually released the Captor X in May of 2020. And so I'm answering your question here, is that it was kind of a slow burn with the pro players because nobody was playing. You know, the whole COVID thing had shut everything down. And I remember I sent 2 boxes to people to try out. And, you know, obviously in Europe, we have our influencers and the YouTubers and all that type of stuff and the media people. But I targeted Phil X and George Lynch. And I remember it was George Lynch because I knew George was good at endorsing things. And I thought he would be interested in the concept. And he was. And I just remember sending something to him and saying, hey, would you be interested in checking this out? And he's like, I don't know what it is, but it sounds awesome. Yeah. And then as that was going on, I'm starting to build a relationship with George. I sent one to Phil X. And I kind of expected Phil to never use it or, you know, to say that's not his thing. And quite conversely, the opposite happened. So I sent one to Phil and he called me up saying thank you and that he'd definitely give it a shot. You know, he's like, probably not my thing, but, you know, thanks for sending it out to me. And the next thing I know, because at the time I'd work with Europe really early in the morning. So sometimes I'd fall asleep for like an hour in the mid-morning or something, just because I'd be up all night and things are just crazy going with business stuff. And I remember I had all these text messages from Felix. Hey man, you around? Hey man, got a question. Hey man, you help me? And then at the same time, I have another text message that said, when did Phil X start using your stuff? I'm like, I'm missing something here. And Phil had put on Instagram, like, this is my new rig. And I can't remember exactly what he said about it, but he just had his Friedman signature head and the Captor X on it. Yeah. And then when I finally talked to him, he said, he goes, yeah, man, this thing just blew people away. He goes, I couldn't get any cabinets out of storage. So I just took that box you sent me and I put it in my overnight bag. And I just figured we'd try it and just see what happened. And he goes, man, they're freaking out about how awesome it is. And he goes, I was messaging you because I moved the EQs around and they were like, man, that sounds great. And I'm like, well, I'll make it better. And he's like, I made it worse. So I was trying to call you so you could, you know, help me.
You're on the fly sound guy at that point, Justin.
Yeah. And so he started using with Bon Jovi instantly. And this is the thing that everybody was doing because the boxes were kind of unknown and unproven. They would mic up a cabinet like an ISO cab. And then they'd have the boxes running in parallel. And then it usually would be like a half hour later, like, we don't want to use the ISO cabs anymore. Yeah. So that's exactly how that happened. And then Alanis
so Justin, let's take a step back and explain what the Captor X really is, because I think a lot of people watching this, they might have heard of the Captor X. They kind of generally might have an idea of it, but when you're sending these out and explaining it to an artist who you know might have a great rig that they're super familiar with, you know, a bunch of amp heads, a full setup, but this is a brand new technology. And honestly, they just don't know what it is. So how do you explain it to somebody?
I'll be careful with this because I painted this box like Van Halen. And actually I did one for Phil because we're both Van Halen freaks. So these are not something you can buy. Though we do have something cool we're working on, not Van Halen related, but something cool with Captor X's. So that was a great question. The thing about a Captor X is it's only a handful, you know, a few pounds. It's kind of the size of a bigger direct box, but it's very portable. And the whole idea with these were, you know, so Two Notes is the company that invented the digital load box. And there's other companies that have come and helped, you know, reinforce that as a real tool. Everybody from UA to Boss to Sir and numerous other people. The thing that was happening is they weren't really very good at being portable.
So let's get real simple. What's a load box?
Okay. So a load box, I have a great story for that. I have to go back and tell you.
Okay.
Going back to the thing about taking lessons, the music store that I took lessons in, they sold Laney amps. Do you guys remember how all the guys had Laney amps? They had the AOR series. They were modded Marshalls, right? And they had all those cool extra gain and all those cool pull EQ knobs. So this is the most Indiana thing I can tell you. So I wanted one of those and they had a used one come in. I think it was $275 or $375. At that time, my age, that should have been like $500,000 instead of $1 million. So I worked detasseling corn that whole summer.
Oh no.
If you've never detasseled corn, it is probably about the worst job you could have. Yeah. So I looked at it as an enterprise type of thing where this is going to fund my music career. long story short, I did the detasseling corn. I think my dad put in a little bit of money, and I was able to get the amp out of layaway. And I was so excited because I had to work all summer. You know, when you're a little kid, a summer might as well be like 6 years. And I got that Laney amp. I got it home, and I'm so excited. And I had that crate G10 that I used at the talent show. And I'm like, cool, I'll just plug the amp out straight into the G10. And man, you know, it's not going to be amazing, but I got this amp, and I'll use that for the speaker.
Yeah, you're on your way.
Yes. And here's what happened. Plug the amp in, plug the guitar in, ready to go, start playing. I don't hear anything. Just turn it up louder, start to hear like the tubes kind of doing their thing. So you kind of heard something like, I still don't hear much. Turn it up louder. The lights went dim, bam, amp blew up. So what happened was I didn't have a load on the amplifier. Nobody told me anything about resistance and impedance and how amplifier tube amps work and how they have to have a load against them so they don't short out. And, you know, nobody told me that. So literally I went through that whole summer exercise, and within 30 seconds, my heart just like, you know, broke in two. And I remember going to the music store, and the guy working there, his name was Wayne. Wayne's like, you need a load box. And I'm like that. He goes, well, it's a resistor thingy. And he didn't really know what he was talking about, but he knew Eddie Van Halen used them from the magazines. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll just go to Radio Shack and buy some resistors or whatever it needs, and I'll just put this stuff together. And then I quickly realized it was not that simple, because tube amplifiers, especially 100-watt amplifiers, can push upwards of 300, 350 watt RMS. So that's a lot of power. What people don't understand is when you turn a tube amp past about 6, it doesn't really get louder. It compresses, but the power is still going up, right? Yeah. So you have to have a load or a speaker against that, so the amp is working properly.
Right. And it's not just the resistor out of your Walkman. You have to have something rated for that power.
Yes. And again, nobody knew that kind of stuff. So the answer that fixed that was a speaker. And I remember taking the G10 amp to another guitar store and getting a used Eminent speaker. And then I had a friend that had this wonky looking giant speaker cab box, just so I could, you know, have something to play through, a speaker to play through. And of course, the problem that didn't fix was now it's just too loud for your house, right? So it drove my family crazy with that. So that was like the first lesson I learned about why you need a load. The easiest way, again, is a speaker cabinet. That fixes the problem of now you've got, you know, the whole setup, but it's volume control. So going back to what you said, and I'm sorry I kind of skipped through all that, but a load box is basically a resistive network that takes that incoming power, the wattage, and basically soaks it out. So you've just, you know, it's heat. So you're just basically offloading it. Yeah. So these boxes are primarily is a big heat sink in there. And then, you know, the resistive network that can handle that kind of wattage and voltage. So they're just really offloading that. But it's not easy to design those. They're not complex now to design, but you have to really know what you're doing to do that properly, because you can easily cause all kinds of problems and things like flyback, you know, voltage and stuff like that. So you can damage an amplifier pretty quickly.
Right.
Now, load boxes, like I said, did exist back then, but they were expensive. They were based on what they called a resistive network, which means resistors, but they could take the power out, but they couldn't really get the sound and feel the same way. But they would dumb down that voltage. But if you ever see what they looked like back then, they were massive. You know, they were industrial strength things. I mean, you're talking high wattage, high current. You can't just buy that stuff at Radio Shack easily. You know,
and especially the older ones, it just sound like throwing a blanket over a speaker.
Absolutely. Yeah, they just didn't sound very good. So that was the big issue. So we've kind of gotten a couple directions, and it's probably my fault, but we're the ones that really kind of pioneered what we call the reactive load, which is now something everybody uses. And reactive load just means that it follows more of a natural curve of how a speaker and speaker cabinet work together. So that way we're able to get that feel and the intricate details of the amplifier are better represented. A resistive network works, but again, but to your point, it has a weird EQ thing that it does. It's more flat, if that's a term. That's a scary word to use with things, but they just didn't work as well as the thing. So the industry standard is now the reactive load.
Right. So to sum it up, it's basically, it emulates a speaker. It's a device that you run out of the back of your amp in place of a speaker, or in addition to, because you do have a pass through on these.
Yes.
So you can run it with or without a speaker cab.
Correct.
And then where does your sound go?
So that's a great question. The thing I will say is I think most people using load boxes now, are a high percentage of them. Again, with the Captor X's, you can still use your speaker cabinets like before for monitoring. I'd say the heaviest amount of users are probably just plugging their amplifier straight into that. And for instance, like I've got a Plexi behind me. You take a Marshall Plexi and you plug it through any guitar cabinet and you turn it on about 1, it's too loud. It's bone crushingly loud. It's really bright. It's kind of fizzy. But you start to turn it up louder, and if you can be anywhere near it, which you can't, it starts to sound like you think it should. Or if as long as the circuits haven't been all hacked up by people over the years. But yeah, you're basically going amplifier out into something like this, and this is the smallest load box that I know of out there. And then you're taking that power, you're sucking it down, taking the heat out, and then you're going out of these outputs straight into your DAW, like your or a mixer at a gig, or your headphones. I mean, I think I don't know the exact percentage, but I'd say almost half the people that buy these, have boutique amps or expensive amplifiers, and they just plug the amp into it and they plug the headphones in, and it sounds amazing. So it just fixes a lot of problems. The thing that's happened over the last few years, and you asked a great question earlier about who's using this way, is the idea is that you can pick from hundreds of different speakers and cabinets together, and they've been done in really good studios and controlled environments, and they just sound amazing out of the gate. And that was really what I've been very big about is, how can we make this so things just sound great out of the box, and they don't frustrate.
Because one thing that I think people also need to know is that your amp's not just going in this box and into headphones. There's IR
capability built into the box.
Yeah, well, so I think you just said something that surprised me back in 2020 was I assumed everybody knew what IR or the full term, impulse response. I assumed everybody knew what that meant. I think a lot more people do now, but they didn't understand what that is. And basically an impulse response is a very short amount of time. It could be in it's usually always in milliseconds, from 25 to 500 or so milliseconds. It's a very quick snapshot of a very short amount of time, but it captures the full nuance of that speaker pushing and how it's being captured through microphones. So if you do it correctly, you can get that short but very direct guitar sound through there. And people always talk about how long impulse responses need to be. There's kind of a phenomenon that happens is impulse responses are great for long reverbs, but you can't do it super long on guitar cabinets because you start to pick up a lot of the anomalies in the rooms. The comb filtering kind of effect happens. You can get some weird phasing and stuff like that. So it has to be a very controlled thing. So I'm just throwing that out to the people that may see this that are more advanced. Longer doesn't always mean better. In fact, it's kind of a diminishing returns thing after a certain point. But yeah, you're digitally capturing that. And to go back a step, before these types of things and the digital IR stuff was around, and IRs are digital, there were analog filtering that people did. And our Captors have analog filtering. You can get really good with analog filtering. And what does that mean? Analog filtering basically is using analog parts to create sort of the natural curve of a speaker cabinet. You can get very, very close, but you can't get like unintelligible close between a digital copy of that. Mm-hmm. So there is a gap from that. And also analog circuits are a certain size. You're not going to find anything that's got 20 different ones on there too, typically. But the biggest thing that analog suffers from in a lot of manufacturers is it just doesn't always sound like, the guitar speaker like you think it should. It tends to roll off the highs and tighten in the lows. But yeah, the impulse tech, if you do it correctly, man, it's pretty imperceptible. And I can tell you about the test I do with people in a minute of how I confuse even the guys with the sharpest ears with that. So
yeah, I'm curious. This circles right back to the original question of, so when you were, obviously you did a session with the guitarist from Smashing Pumpkins. Explain, number one, how that kind of comes about for Two Notes, and then what's that process when you step into the studio and you start saying, okay, we want to get the sound. How, because you obviously have to have some kind of amazing ear yourself to be able to direct that to get these guitar tones that just are impeccably close to the tones that those artists play normally.
Yeah. So going back to the great thing about impulse technology or impulse response technology is you have the ability to get these very small amounts of time captured, right? And they literally, if you do it right, it will capture exactly what you gave it. Problem is, if you don't know what you're doing, you can capture a lot of wrong things. The bigger issue with impulse-based tech is you start to get libraries from people, and they've moved every little microphone 6,000 different ways. And next thing you know, you're trying to load a file one at a time, and then you're going, well, that sounds pretty good. What's better? And then the next thing you know, you're 6 into it deep, and now you're 500 into it deep, and you have no idea what you just heard. You have no clue. So your confirmation bias is taking over, and now you've got analysis paralysis, which I always say we kind of have these polar audiences. You have the people that want to go to the infinite degree to tweak, right? They're almost like experimentations more than anything. And then you have the people that want to make music. And the thing with a lot of people is they want it to sound great right away. Like they'll say, what's the best IR? It's the most subjective thing ever. But going back to like commercially available things and how I'll get into how our stuff's a little different. You hope it was captured right, but you don't know what you're hearing. And the next thing you know, you've tried out 1,000 of these files looking for the perfect one, and now you have no idea where you are. It's almost like walking in the Sahara Desert, and you've gone 40 miles, and you're trying to find which way you should go. You're like looking at the sun. Okay, is that going to help? Maybe when the stars come out. So you completely lost all conscious, rationality of really what's going on. So I'm going back to your question now. Is so for Jeff, by the way, Jeff Schroeder. I was at their gig, not in the studio.
Oh, okay.
But I did send some of these to Jeff because he does a lot of home recording, and everybody's recording at home now. So Jeff uses the Captors at home because he's got a myriad of different amplifiers. Okay. So cool. I help Jeff like with the right impulses, which we have our own type called the DynIR, dynamic RR. But I worked with Jeff to get like what I knew he was searching for, and we kind of dialed in his rig more or less at his house. So he's, obviously on the road to Smashing Pumpkins. And when I saw them last week, it was really just to see the rig, talk to the guys. A guy named Trace that owns Voodoo Amps is his guitar tech. And Trace is a very sharp guy and knows amps inside and out. He's repaired millions for AC/DC to Joe Perry and Brad Whitford and all those guys. So Trace is like the old guard, and he absolutely was raving about the Captors. He's like, man, these are amazing. So just to give you the specific of that, they still had big giant ISO cabinets under the stage that they used as backups, but they just said, man, they don't sound very good. They're congested. They don't work very well. And Jeff's like, man, my sound has never been better. He's also using the Rev generators, which are amazing amplifiers. They have a ton of channels and flexibility. And the thing he always tells me when people know what they're doing is like all his knobs were set pretty much at noon. So it just meant he was getting a great sound out of the box. And then he was going straight into the Captor, and that was pretty much his rig. And then but you think of the size of that. If people have ever seen an ISO cabinet, I mean, those cases can weigh hundreds of pounds. They can be gigantic. And then something like this is a few pounds and very easy to transport, and it sounds better.
Well, speak more about the library of cabinets that you have for this, because, if someone wants to experiment with a Marshall or a Boogie or an Angle, or it seems endless. So speak to that a little bit.
So Two Notes has always had a proprietary format system they used, but didn't really have a name on it before, but now it stands for dynamic IR. And the dynamic sense meaning you can move microphones, like virtual microphones, in different proximities. So it's like, what does it sound up close? What does it sound like back? What does it sound like in the back of the cabinet? And you can blend combinations of multiple microphones together. Like our software, you can do dozens of microphones if you wanted, but most people use one or two. And the blending of microphones has been a big thing. And that's where I go back into the cost factor. If you could get a ribbon microphone, you could get a dynamic microphone, you could get good preamps, you're probably spending $5,000 to $10,000. And now you've got this very valuable stuff you're trying to take to gigs. It just isn't very practical. Plus, you don't have any of these phase problems that are very inherent of using multiple mics. All the traditional issues go completely away, and it just sounds better. So Two Notes had a system they'd been using for years. They just didn't have an official name on it. But they were going to various studios and having what we called our capture masters make different profiles of the cabinets. So they were done in different studios, and then we started partnering with companies like Celestion and then Boogie, and then that started to put a lot of weight on officially licensed things. And you hope that working with these manufacturers, they have those ears right to do that. So we've worked with so many companies, Ingle, the Ingle stuff. We got even more coming with Ingle, Orange, Rev. Sir, Mesa. I mean, there's a ton of different ones. Victory is a company that did some great stuff with us recently as well. So that kind of is organically expanded. So it's like we have like 600 different options you can get now, which is for a lot of people overwhelming. When I came in a couple of years ago, and COVID was kind of the spark of this, like I said, I sent something to George Lynch and he thought it was really cool. Didn't really understand the tech, but he thought the principle was cool. I called him up. I said, why don't we do like an artist series with you? Because George had some really cool vintage gear. And he's like, you were going to get George talking, talk to him about vintage guitars and amps. He loves that. Like he's like a kid like the rest of us. He turns 12 years old and his eyes light up and he's more than happy to talk about it. And he's also a very particular kind of guy and he's very much into tinkering. So basically I'm taking 5 of his cabinets that are his prize cabinets that he has swapped a million different speakers out, trying to find the perfect ones. And he had one of Eddie Van Halen's cabinets that Ed had in the 70s that was sold to George in like 81 or something like that. And we went to Henson Studios, which it was his favorite, rock guitar room. And we went in there and we did 5 cabinets and, it sounded like his cabinets, being mic'd up. So we used all the microphones we kind of agreed on and we got to use, an amazing console in there. And it really worked really, really well. So the whole idea of that though is I didn't want people to fall in that maze of the IR, like where's the perfect IR and, how do I find it and how do I go through these giant libraries to find that stuff? I wanted to make it so it was going to sound great out of the gate. You just load the cabinets up and right away you're like, man, this is awesome. And then if you want to get particular and move things around, you can. But that was the whole idea, is a trusted artist, a great studio, using my ears on top of it to really validate, are we hearing what we should be hearing and stuff like that.
I think a lot of it too is in there's so many technologies out there now. I think the old KISS, keep it simple, stupid method, or less is more, is actually really important, because I think, like you said, musicians, I'm the same way, being a guy that's self-taught, when I would look for and hunt for a sound, I'd be like, I don't have all the money in the world to go buy a Neumann mic and like a Neve console to put, run it through to try to make this thing sound good. And with the IR stuff, when I can just plug and play, it makes it so much more enjoyable to play the music, because we're artists first, right? We're tinkerers second, but we're artists first.
It's about being inspired.
Yeah, I want to get to the art. I don't want to get, some people, I guess if you're the engineer type and you're the tinker, great. You've got that option with the Captor. But if you're the guy that's like, man, I just want to get going, and I want to play something from Lynch Mob and I want that sound, I want to be able to plug that thing in and just go, right?
Yeah, have good defaults from just straight out of the box.
Well, I know one of my buddies is going to ask this: when are you going to make a Boston tone to replicate the old Rockman thing? Because he's like, I've been searching for that Boston, that Tom Scholl sound for the last 40 years. That's going to have to be what you're going to have to work on next, Justin, just for my buddy.
I can't announce it through here, and I wish I could, but I can't give all the particulars yet. But we have a new software replacing Wall of Sound called Genome that's about to be released, and Genomes is still fairly light, but it's a full end-to-end amplifier, DynIR, post effects, all kinds of stuff. There's an evolutionary path with this. So when you say things like Boston and stuff like that, people are going to be really impressed, I think.
Stay tuned.
Okay, cool.
There's your little teaser for everybody watching here on YouTube land.
Yeah, well, when
this is where I go back to
coming out, you got to let me know, Justin, so I can ping my buddy and be like, I got it for you.
We have some absolutely brilliant, world-class engineers. We just hired a couple guys in the U.S. a few months back that came from another very well-known digital company, and I won't say the name to flag that, but we have a very great, very smart engineering team. So we're moving. I mean, we'll always be known for this stuff, but we're definitely increasing the breadth of stuff that we're doing.
And that leads to another question I had for you: is how does your team get their inspiration? I mean, there's so many technologies out there. What drives them to be like, yeah, instead of going down that path that everybody else is going down, let's go bushwhack that path over here instead and create something unique? How does that come about? Have you ever had the inside look at your engineering team's kind of thought process?
Yeah, and this is no different than every music product company from the beginning of time that started using electricity with things. Engineers don't always hear things like an artist does, and artists don't usually understand the constraints and the complications of what it takes to engineer a product. I'll be very careful how I say this, but designing an analog guitar pedal like a distortion pedal, it's been done a million different ways. There's only so many different ways you're going to put resistors and capacitors and any kind of little chips, you know, in there that can do so many different things. Eventually, it just kind of, there's only so much that limitation can do. When you start getting into the digital world, it's exponentially more complicated. You're dealing with ones and zeros. You're dealing with a completely different way of thinking. There's a lot of very complex factors at play. So it's not easy to just build stuff, you know, from the ground up. It's easy when you can see other people do it, but it's still so much harder to do real digital stuff than it is to build pedals.
Well, especially people who can have anything, they have the choice of using it or not. And that's one of the great things is people are gravitating towards the 2-notes boxes.
And by the way, I'm trying to segregate us a little bit that's similar market, but a different, you know, different use case, I guess. But I mean, I love analog boxes, right? But there's just a different way of thinking how those go in, and it requires years of research and development. You've got to have very astute engineers that are really passionate about what they're doing. So the question you asked me is more of the hows and whys of that. And you got to find people that are inspired. You got to find people that live it, you know, and usually most people play guitar, bass, you know, or do music to a certain extent, because you do have to apply the methodologies of this comes from a research and development and engineering perspective, but it's got to be able to be, you know, used as a tool. And I'm going to go back to something. You said something that was really, really dead on. A lot of people that buy these just turn the little selector knob on the front, you know, to pick a cabinet out of there. And I'll go back to Phil X when he was with Bon Jovi. He didn't have any extra cabinets at the time or anything he was using. We didn't do a signature pack with him yet. He turned on preset number 1. It was called Heavy Dry. And he just said, man, it was amazing. You know, so that's the whole idea to what you're saying.
You don't need an iPad or have to be some kind of computer programmer to use this.
Not at all.
They're real simple out of the box.
The catch-22 with building like digital guitar products is if you have a very locked system, you apply to an appeal to a large group of people, but then there's always this other group that says, but what if it did this? And that's the Pandora's box that everybody has to open, because as soon as you don't offer the, if it only did this, whatever this is, you know, then you're in a whole different market. So I want to make sure people understand that these are very simple to use. A lot of people just plug their amp in, plug a guitar in, turn on the knob, and you're there. Yeah. But it's about that chasing of the infinite things, like the little bitty, you know, nuances that people want to dig into. And we're pretty good about getting those in there too.
What do you see missing in the gear business today? I mean, there's so many products out there. Like if in the world, according to Justin, you were like, hey, this is the piece of gear that's really needed, and we're not trying to obviously give away like, hey, go make this, but what do you see kind of being something that might be missing or something that needs to be improved on in the guitar world?
The first thing that came to mind, and I'll be kind of snarky about it, is people need to start practicing more, right? Practice, work on songs, you know, play with the band, you know. It's those old methodologies. And I'll kind of revert back a step. Do you remember back in the 80s, early 90s, like a guitar guy like Van Halen or whoever, they were known for playing one guitar, and they played a Marshall amp, and they may use a couple pedals, right? Yeah. But the gear thing to me, and I am as guilty as anybody else times 1,000, is the gear thing didn't really explode like it did until the internet really came around. As far as the incessant, you know, gear acquisition syndrome and tone chasing to that nth degree. And it's kind of fed upon itself. So the amazing thing that we have is there are so many amazing options out there. And if you look back to what we had, then it was like there were 3 amp companies, and you couldn't afford the one you wanted. And
your Boss MXR and Ibanez, and you're like, all right, which pedal can I afford for $150? You know?
And for me, it was always the wasn't the Digitech, it was the DOD.
Yeah, the DOD. Yeah, that's right.
And I remember, by the way, getting my first pedal was an American Metal pedal. It was a DOD. And I remember the guy demoed it for me, and he turns the tone knob all the way. He's like, now it sounds like you're in your basement listening to it outside. Yeah, I was like, well, that's so crazy, and it sounded pretty nasty. It didn't sound great, but distortion in it, right?
It sounded like the first Exodus album or something.
yeah, exactly. And the thing is, now anybody starting out or whatever plugs into it, and it sounds like this great mastered record, you know, almost. Now you got to make it sound like that. So my snarky joke is, yes, people need to start practicing more and stop trying to find a box that replaces that, because it's never going to. The old joke is, how do you sound like Van Halen? Oh, have his hands. You know, that's the truth. The thing that I see is missing really though is, this is hard to talk about, is guitar amplifiers and tech and things like that have improved drastically, but it seems that, and we're doing the same thing, is everybody's reinventing the wheel, so to speak.
Yeah.
Now, the thing that we're all trying to do is make better, amp sims and things like that. And I would be remiss if I didn't say this, because people can say, why do I want an amplifier and a Captor X when I can just plug in XYZ modeler and it's all there for me?
Right.
If you really know the interaction between an amplifier and a guitar, it's pretty complex. They're both instruments, and one is giving a certain thing and one is getting and giving something different. And there's a feel and response that, using volume knobs and cables and the pickups, how they're set, and how your hands are creating these little electric, pulses going through the pickups. Those are the nuances that are extremely difficult to replicate. So it's kind of like, if you think that you've got this cranked up Marshall Plexi in a box, you kind of do. But if you haven't cranked up a Marshall Plexi to really know what a Plexi does, then you'd be completely, jarred, because it's like fighting you, and it's got these nasty things. But if you can tame that bull, you'll be very well rewarded. Those are the little things that some people, I don't think, care about. They don't experience. But when you know that, and you have that kind of relationship, I think Kempers are amazing, and I've had one for, oh gosh, since 2011. But when you put in a Dumble or something like that, nobody ever has a Dumble, right? Like,
Yeah.
a few people. But you plug in that Dumble preset, as far as you know, it's working just like a Dumble does, right?
Yeah.
Go play a real Dumble amp that was modeled after, or whatever it's profiled after. It's a completely different relationship.
Yeah. And that's
That
why
amp is-
Dumble's $200,000 versus, even the Dumble pedal that's going to be $75.
Well, and how much of that is romanticizing those old amps?
Definitely a lot. By the way, a lot of Dumbles were built for the player. And Howard Alexander, whatever he was called at the time, he built things for the player. But I will tell you, those things are there, and if you hear those nuances, they're there.
Yeah.
I have a guy that does. I'm in Austin right now, and the guy that repaired my guitar also does Eric Johnson's. He said Eric can hear the difference of frets are in. So if you're putting frets in a different direction, he can hear those. And I think people think Eric's crazy, but he's not. He hears those things.
Yeah.
If you blind test people and they start getting stuff wrong, then that's one thing. But going back to the thing with like the Kemper effect, and again, Kempers are amazing. Don't take anything I said differently. But if I had a Marshall that I'm playing through live, and I had the copy of that same Marshall, the interactivity between the two is completely different. And we refer to that more of like impedance imbalances. It's just, there's a complex thing that's going on there that profiling like that just doesn't capture all of. So the good thing is that everything's close. I think we're in the very high percentages, but it's getting those little details are very, very complex. Yes.
The nuances that make everything. Yeah. Without those, everything falls flat, because it's all in the details in reality is what it really comes down to.
And as far as practicality goes, I mean, a modeler will win, because it's a little box you can take in places. But the people that, are using Captor X, they still like that relationship between their amplifier. And it is very, very important. I've seen Steve Vai last night. Steve uses fractals for his effects, right? Why doesn't Steve just use the modeling in there? Is it because he doesn't like them or he doesn't know how to use them? He knows what he hears, and he still wants that organic tube interaction thing. I mean, he knows what he hears.
It's the feel, it's the inspiration. It all, goes back to the artist side of things.
Yeah. So I had to throw that in there because there is a differentiation, and some people argue that, they'll debate it. Some people don't hear it. And I guess if you don't hear it, then it doesn't matter. But when you know it and it's there, and you can pick 10 times out of 10 what's what, it's very realistic. So I don't want to sound like I'm on a sales campaign for that. I'm just telling you, if you hear it,
you know it.
It's there.
Yeah. Last question, then we're going to let you go. With COVID, we saw a huge spike in interest in guitar. I think it was like a 20 or 30% interest bump from 2019 to 2020 and on, right? Do you think that that's going to stick? Do you think the guitar is going to stay a mainstay instrument, or do you think this is going to be kind of a false blip in the music industry and guitar is going to wane again like it did in the 80s and 90s, and it's going to cycle back to electronic music and the things that were starting to eat away at the actual guitar industry?
That's a complex question that I think if anybody had if they had a crystal ball or could really see into the future, it's a $1 trillion idea, right? If you could really do that. So let's talk about a couple of things. First thing is, I think anytime you get people into guitar, you get people into music, you're obviously going to have people that get into it real quick and then they go out of it real quick. So it's kind of like a funnel. The more you put in, the more that should stick through. So I'm very optimistic that electric guitar in particular, has been reinvigorated, and will carry out. I think that it's going to hold pretty steady when it comes to that. I mean, is it going to have the big boom it had the last couple of years? Probably not. But going back, I didn't realize at the time as a kid, but the 80s to probably 93, 94 were boom times for electric guitar and music, right? And everything had a guitar in it. And if it went from shred to grunge, it still had guitar in it, right? So that was very, very prevalent. I think what you're asking, or what I'm just thinking is going to happen, is there's a whole generation of people that probably just start picking up guitar in the last couple of years that I think we're going to see carry this out in the future. And yeah. I think the immediate return isn't as big. Now, as far as the product industry seeing a big blip, yeah, I think it's pretty true. But it's a great blip, right? Yeah. I think anything that can kind of spark or jumpstart anything is a great step. Are we going to do this, have this vertical line like that? Probably not. I don't think that's reality.
Yeah, I think the hockey stick happened early in COVID. And I think now we're seeing the leveling off with younger students getting back to school and things like that. Yeah. And I think we're seeing, it's interesting though, it's reinvigorated a lot of the older players is what I've really seen. The guys like me in my 40s, the 50s and 60s are all of a sudden picking up those guitars again and saying, hey, I can kind of have that midlife crisis now because there's all this new technology I was unaware of after, the 90s when I maybe picked it up, or when I was 16, 17, that now they're like, oh, I can do all this cool stuff with it and have the expendable cash to be able to actually go and do it. So it's kind of interesting. So a couple quick questions for you, and then we'll let you go. What are you listening to these days? Like what music, like what's inspiring you as an artist?
Ooh, good question. I have to look up my Spotify list.
Okay.
So, yeah. I think that people that are my friends, people that have lived with me, they think that I'm 14 years old. So, so I remember the Spotify list came up, and I was like in the 0.0001% of Van Halen fans. I'm like, okay. So yes, I think the things that
so not a current 14-year-old music taste. It's your old 14 music taste.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the list here. It's interesting because I think when you get into music, I think by the time you're 14 or 15, a lot of those things are very much part of now your DNA, and they're very much a part of your life. And it's interesting. We had Austin City Limits out here, and there are some punk rock type bands and other things playing out there. You can tell the acts that are playing by the age of their audience. So when you have some of these bands come back, you can see these people in their 30s that were 13 years old when they saw these people. The Red Hot Chili Peppers played out here, which was interesting because I saw people our ages. I saw people that were in their 30s. I saw people that were teenagers, because they've kind of had different parts of their career, right? But the big thing is that music really becomes part of people, I think, by their mid-teens, and those things are always going to follow them. You may kind of run away from them, but you come back to them. So you asked a very specific question. I have a band where we do live karaoke, and you never know what song's coming next. And we use 7 or 8 different tunings, but could play things from Danzig to the Cranberries to Blondie to Pantera to Fall Out Boy, and there's a big resurgence of bands like The Killers, and which never really went away, and My Chemical Romance. It's like these bands are kind of nostalgic now for people,
right?
So you have those old bands, but then when I think the thing for me that's always been good, and probably for other people, is just playing contemporary music with people. If you're playing like neo soul or you're playing new blues or whatever, it's just being exposed to those artists and having to play those songs, because I don't always find things on my own, right? I need different things to get out there. So the short answer is there's a lot of stuff, old, new. Like I never listened to My Chemical Romance, but now that I have to play the songs, I kind of listen to it in a different way. And I know that's not necessarily new, but like in Austin, we have guys like Gary Clark Jr., kind of carrying that guitar torch. So, I think with music, you just got to keep moving forward, and you got to keep adding to things.
Yeah.
The thing about Steve Vai last night is Steve will always be this 80s guitar hero, right? But Steve's a guy that doesn't stay in the 80s, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, he's very much about, I want to do stuff,
Yeah.
perform new things and compose.
He's not living off of the old name. He's not saying Great White does it, but those guys still do their thing.
Yeah.
But it's always the thing they did previously. Whereas Steve's constantly trying to mess with my sound, his different abilities, and how does he take it to another level where
playing 4 guitars at once,
exactly. The Hydra is his thing, right?
And that was super, super cool, by the way. Super
really?
cool. He made it look easy. You said something, I'll go back and I won't keep this too long, but we grew up with guitar heroes.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask a pointed question. Guys like Vai, Van Halen, Malmsteen, they're still guitar heroes now, right? They're still very important. They have stood the test of time. What's the first guitar hero that comes in your name that's newer?
Oh, I like a guy, actually, he's a folk artist and a singer-songwriter, but I like a guy by the name of Travis Shallow. So I follow him because he reminds me of that throwback musician in a time now that you don't have a lot of that, right? Yeah. But he's kind of relatively unknown, but he's an awesome musician. But when you think about quote unquote guitar heroes, it's hard to find that guy that's the electric guitar hero. You're like, dude, I want to be like that guy. It's just because I think a lot of times the bands don't push the guitarist up to the front of the line as much as they used to.
Well, the answer is to me, the newest guitar heroes that pop to me immediately are Joe Bonamassa, John Mayer, right?
Yeah.
But they're all in their, all getting to their mid 40s. You know what I mean?
They're not young guys. I wouldn't classify those as new modern guitarists, though. See,
not at all. Not at all.
They're now part of the old guard, carrying the blues torch. They're the next Clapton, BB King. They're those guys coming,
Well, yeah, they've been doing it forever, and social media has kind of elevated them to give them a much wider reach than they had before when they were
absolutely. They've got this audience of people with disposable income again, right?
Yeah.
But I think of Tim Henson and the Polyphia thing,
Tim Henson,
some of those guys. I mean,
like Corey Wong, maybe.
Yeah, Corey's amazing. I think any of those guys, helping push that new thing. But you said what's missing. I want to see more amazing female guitar players because there's so many of them out there now. Really, yeah. I want not to be such a male-dominated thing that it's always been. I think that the playing field's very open. So
what's her name? Strauss. She's awesome.
Strauss,
yeah. She plays with Alice. I mean,
she actually left and she's with Demi Lovato right now.
Oh, she is? Okay. I knew she was playing with him and then
left.
Yeah. Okay.
And she's great. Lori Basilio, who she got some of our Captor X's. Lori's amazing. There's a whole breed of younger player. Again, it doesn't matter, male, female, whatever. None of that really matters. I hope, going back a minute ago, that what did guitar do the last few years? I hope that carries in to just keep inspiring people. And we have all these up and coming players, right?
Yeah.
Not anybody in their mid 40s, which is me and whoever else, right? We need to keep a new breed coming up, right? Yeah. So hopefully the last couple
that's one cool thing is following the Two Notes Instagram account is you guys have amazing players, and just watching your stories every day, I'm just blown away by the talent that you guys are featuring through your Instagram.
Yeah, and a lot of those people are very unknown, but they're wonderful players. And again, it should inspire people, not be a detriment, right? You shouldn't say, "Oh, those people are so good, I don't even need to play." It should be the opposite. It should be going, "I want to play more now."
Yeah. So everyone should follow Two Notes on Instagram. You should follow pedal.ly on Instagram.
Yeah. And last question, because I got to get this out of you because you're a gear nut. So you couldn't have any Two Note stuff. What are the 3 pedals that are on your dream board? Only 3. You can only have 3 pedals. What are those 3 pedals you're popping on your board?
Well, the first one I'm going to say is a Klon, not because I think it's the best pedal ever made. It's that I bought one from Bill in the 90s for $300, and I think I sold it for $200. So I want that $10,000 pedal that I gave away or traded for block or something dumb.
Sorry, Justin, no refunds on that one.
So you asked a good question, and we'll keep the Klon there. A tuner. A great tuner is the most important thing any guitar player can have. And I think most guitar players play horribly out of tune, which, hey, if you're inspired, great. But man, a great tuner. Number one. I think a nice, simple digital delay is a great thing to have. if you get creative with delays, you can have it so it does this long flowing thing. You can use it for special effects, or you can use it just to create some nice weight between your sound. I think that's a definite go-to. Man, I really like the Wampler bell pedal. Is probably my favorite pedal right now. It's based off of a Nobles pedal.
Okay.
And it just, like, I plug it through my Marshall and I can turn the Marshall quiet and it just sounds great. So I think for me, a tuner, maybe something like that bell pedal, which is a Nobles inspired, and a delay. I think if I could only have 3, that would be it.
Cool. Awesome. Well, any parting words for the audience? Anything that you want to shout out about Two Notes, new stuff coming out, anything like that?
Well, of course. First thing is, people need to buy from you. Go to Pepe, talk to these guys. They sell Two Note stuff. They sell all kinds of good stuff. You are seeing in my hands the final revisions of the Revolt series coming out. So we got the Revolt guitar, which is a 3-channel with boosts, and you can add extra channels to your amp. You got effects loops. You get this amazing DI out, and we have the bass Revolt, which is another 3-channel bass preamp. We have so much demand on these. These will be coming out in the next handful of weeks. I'm super excited to finally get these out, as we all are. So the Revolts are going to be kind of our new thing. And actually, this is the final version. I had a few last minute changes made to it, but this is the final version. I just got a couple hours ago. So I'll be putting it through the paces, but those will be coming out, and you guys will be selling those too. So they're going to be
cool. Very cool.
I think they're one of the most in demand products of 2022. So we need to get them out in 2022. Yes.
Definitely. Well, Justin, thank you so much for the time. We appreciate it. And for all of you out there listening and watching, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you have any comments for Justin, go ahead and comment below, and we'll make sure Justin gets them and answers them. And we'll look forward to having you on again, Justin, as we move forward and we keep the jam sessions rocking. And we're looking forward to seeing all the cool stuff that happens with Two Notes. And if there's any way we can support you guys, we're always here for you, man.
Well, likewise, we're here to help you guys out too. So, we're partners. So I appreciate that. And
awesome.
Man, thanks for asking the questions. I don't really get to geek out like this very often. So I get super excited, and it's like we have a short amount of time. I'm like, we need 10 more hours. And then
right. It flew by.
Yeah. And trust me, we're going to have you on more, man. This is good conversation.
Thank you guys very much. This was great.
Have an awesome day. And yeah, we'll stay in touch, buddy.
Yeah.
Thanks, Justin.
Play loud, practice well. See you guys.